Let's take to the airspace between Somalia and Somaliland. You will remember that the two territories are in dispute. Somaliland declared itself independent from Somalia back in the 1990s when Somalia was racked by a civil war that continues, albeit with much less intensity, up to today. The ramifications, though, are felt in many different ways, including what Somaliland can and can't do. For the record, neither Somalia nor the rest of the world recognizes Somaliland's claim to independence, except for Ethiopia. Back to the airspace. Somaliland is accusing Somalia of giving commercial airline pilots the wrong information. And as far as Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland, is concerned, these instructions led to a near collision on at least one occasion recently. This is the second time Somaliland has accused Somalia of air traffic control errors, but Somalia's information minister has given short shrift to the accusations, and so has Emirates, one of the airlines named by Somaliland. Just to say that Somalia's airport was quite central to the civil war I mentioned earlier, as you'll hear in this interview with Sean Mendes, currently an aviation consultant, but back in 2013, when the civil war was underway, he used to run Mogadishu's airport. He picked up the story of the fight over the control of the airspace.
So in January of 2024, starting in January 2024, we've begun to see some reports from aircraft flying over Somalia in the Class A airspace. So the Class A airspace is the fully controlled airspace where basically it's large commercial jets flying at 16,000 feet and high. And the frequency with which you talk to air traffic controllers over Somalia is 132.5 megahertz. Now, that is supposed to be managed from Mogadishu. However, we've seen reports that when aircraft are close to Hargeisa, so basically over the territory that is claimed by Somaliland, they have other air traffic controllers or people pretending to be air traffic controllers speaking to them on that same 132.5 megahertz frequency and giving them instructions that are in conflict with those that the controllers in Mogadishu had earlier given them. So, for example, they might tell them to descend, in altitude or to change a course. And some of those have been benign, but a handful of those have actually caused conflicts where, one aircraft had been given an order by Mogadishu and another aircraft had been given an order by Hargeisa. And these aircraft have potentially been put on collision courses. Fortunately, aircraft are equipped with TCAS, which is traffic collision avoidance systems. It's basically like a radar on the aircraft that warns if another aircraft is going to be coming too close to you. So these have been avoided. There is a fail-safe in place, but obviously this is something that is not a good thing when you're coming down to your last line of defense, and therefore it has become a concern for the international aviation community.
But this is not the first instance of that happening, right? It has happened before.
It has happened a few times since January this year. There have been multiple instances of this reported. Remember, it has only been since 2017 that the airspace reverted back to Somali control, and only since 2023 that there's been full air traffic control coverage in Class A airspace over the entire country. So, it's been a very limited window since this has happened, and unfortunately, reports of this happening, including with some major airlines like Ethiopian Airlines, Qatar Airways, etc., over the last few months. And I think that's what's highlighted this as an issue recently.
So essentially, we're talking about Somalia restoring its authority over the airspace and in that way nullifying Somaliland's claim to independence.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think, Somaliland is not recognized internationally and is not a member of the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. So ICAO basically carves up the world into different flight information regions. These are basically jurisdictions over which, different countries can exert air traffic control authority. And since Somaliland is not a United Nations member state, the airspace of Somaliland is controlled by Somalia. Furthermore, Somaliland doesn't actually have the capacity to control airspace over the entire landmass there. That all those investments in that technology is invested in Mogadishu. There was an agreement in 2017 between Somaliland and Somalia on how to share the revenues from the air traffic control. But as the politics have become more complicated, I presume there are issues with that agreement as well now.
And what are the complications in the politics that you're talking about?
Well, I think the complications are primarily, brought forward by this Ethiopian pseudo recognition of Somaliland. And, obviously, I think it's one of the topmost priorities in Somali politics, in my experience, has been to ensure that Somaliland has autonomy rather than independence. So, similarly to way, they treat Jubaland or Puntland in the north, they want the same thing for Somaliland, at least the federal government of Somalia does. So I think, any attempt by Somaliland to gain international recognition, whether that's through port agreements with Ethiopia, whether that's through air traffic control, exertion of their right to control their own airspace rather than allowing that to be controlled from Mogadishu. These are all things that Somalia, the federal government of Somalia, views as potentially detrimental to Somalia's domestic and foreign interests.
Could we see an accident happening in the air because of this tension?
I think it's highly unlikely that it will result in an accident. I think there have been adequate safeguards put in place, even before these incidents, but even subsequently. There is a, large transport category aircraft that are operating in Class A airspace are all equipped with TCAS. Which will ensure that there is not going to be a collision or even a near miss between aircraft. They're not going to come too close to each other. Beyond that, there is what is known as the CPDLC, the Controller Pilot Data Link Communication, which basically is like a text message system where, rather than just voice communication between an aircraft and air traffic control, this is like a text messaging system between them. And the CPDLC obviously cannot be spoofed like a voice frequency can. So the recommendation again for pilots operating in Mogadishu is if you have any questions about a voice instruction that's given to you, confirm it via the CPDLC. And I think since more and more airlines have begun implementing this, this double checking and other procedural aspects of it, we've seen a reduction in the number of these incidents. And I think it's irresponsible, whoever is doing it, to give conflicting instructions, but I think the aviation industry is robust enough and has strong enough safety practices that the risk of this can be mitigated and minimized.
Well, the reason why we're talking about it is because it seems like there are, it's becoming more dangerous because Somaliland is claiming that an Emirates plane nearly collided with an Ethiopian airline flight on Sunday. So I'm just wondering, what's the answer to this? What's the solution?
I think the solution for this is that Somaliland and Somalia need to both start acting like adults. They need to sit down around a table and, you're putting innocent lives at jeopardy over a political dispute. And while certainly you're entitled to have your political views and to make a point, that shouldn't be at the cost of exposing innocent passengers on these planes to risk, no matter how small that risk may be. And like a lot of countries that have just come out of civil war, there tends to be a confrontation first and then negotiate attitude that is taken there. I know that has definitely been true of my experience doing business in Somalia, but they've now got control of their airspace back for the last 7 to 10 years, and they need to start acting responsibly like many other countries in the international aviation community do when they have disputes.
So I have in my notes here that you used to run Mogadishu Airport. Is that true?
Yes, it is. I was running Mogadishu Airport for SKA International Group back in 2013, back when it really was the wild, wild west.
Right. So running the airport, what does it mean?
We were in charge of all airport activities. We lived on the airport property. We would be up at 5:30 in the morning, do a perimeter check, open the gates, let the local staff and the passengers in. We did the check-in, the loading of the flights, pretty much everything A to Z at the airport. So yeah, that was an interesting job.
Yeah, because I mean, Somalia was in an active war at the time, right? It was much hairier than it is now, and the airport was
It was
bombed at
definitely
various
hairier than
times
it
as well.
is. I
Yeah.
think
Mm.
we were fortunate enough that 2013 was beginning to see the beginnings of stability. Electricity was coming back. There was internet. There was a banking system beginning to come back into action. And obviously at the airport was the green zone. We had the African Union and the United Nations troops all based inside the airport green zone. So it was relatively safe for us where we were operating. Yes, we did have periodic attacks from time to time, but generally I found it to be a very satisfying job because the small things that we did all had a very big impact in terms of reopening Somalia to the world community. And, I'm very proud of the work that our team did back then.
So Somalia doesn't really need this particular argument to blow up, right? It doesn't need the airport to become a zone of conflict again, or
No,
airspace. Yeah.
absolutely not. And I think, it is very, very important for Somalia to reconnect itself with the world via aviation because, Somalia does not have very good ground infrastructure. It's not that easy to get from, say, Mogadishu to Galway or to Hargeisa or Bosaso, any of the other, secondary cities in the country via road links. There is zero rail links. So, we've seen development of airports. A lot of Somalis in the diaspora have invested heavily in airport infrastructure all across the country over the last decade. They've received aid from various countries in the Middle East and Asia, Turkey as well, to help develop these airports. So aviation has a very important, in fact, probably an outsized role in terms of helping relink Somalia both to itself as well as to the outside world. And anything that that slows down or obstructs that progress being made cannot be good for Somalia in general and for the peace process as well. It's person-to-person ties and links between countries that ensure stability and peace, and anything that is designed intentionally to obstruct that, it can never be good.
And that's the aviation consultant, Sean Mendes.